Good morning. I'm Julia Roller, and many of you may know me as the mom of those two little blonde boys who are always dashing off to the donuts right after church. So much of my identity is now tied up in being their mom, but this transition to seeing myself as a mom, it wasn't an easy one. Before I had my older son, I felt like things between God and me were pretty good. I worked as a writer and editor of Christian books, so I got lots of time to study the Bible for my job. And I worked at home, so I had lots of quiet time for prayer. And then I had a baby, and all that changed, as many of you can probably relate to. This little baby was so sweet and so cute, and I loved him so much, but it seemed like he took up every single minute of my time, mostly for eating. There were so many astonishingly wonderful things about being a parent, but there were also a lot of challenges. One of our main challenges with my son Ben was that as an infant, he was losing rather than gaining weight. My most important job as his mother was to feed him, and I didn't do it well. In fact, I've never failed at anything so completely in my life. I felt sadness, frustration, resentment, impatience, and even anger. This job of motherhood was revealing these tremendous cracks in my idea of myself as this really good person who was pretty close to God. I was not as patient or loving or kind or just plain good as I had thought I was. I felt overcome by a sense of inadequacy and a sense of my own sinfulness. At the same time, I didn't seem to have any time to study the Bible. I didn't have any quiet for prayer. I'd never felt further from God. Prayer especially felt difficult. Maybe this has happened to some of you. You say you'll pray, you think about praying, maybe you even read about praying, but as for actual prayer, not a whole lot happens. One turning point came for me when I had a really challenging work deadline, and Ben was really sick with a terrible cold. I needed him to be well so he could go to school so I could do my work. I wanted to ask God for help, but I felt worried about asking for the wrong thing. I felt like it was selfish in me to ask for him to get better because I wanted him to get better, at least partially, so I could work. I also worried I shouldn't ask because I felt so disconnected from God anyway. I didn't want to be one of those 911 Christians who only calls in case of emergency. It's a fine balance we have to find in prayer between seeking for God's will and just asking boldly. And I decided if I was going to err, I wanted to err on the side of asking boldly. So that day I decided to ask boldly. I stood over Ben's bed as he slept, and I prayed for God to take away the cold. For good measure, I added a prayer of Martin Luther's that ends this way. Remember, dear Heavenly Father, how you have at all times supported and helped your people. I will not stop knocking, but will continue crying aloud and pleading to the end of my life. That is what I wanted to do, to continue crying aloud to God as often as I could remember to do it. That was a powerful prayer. I felt the power of it. I know that God heard me, and Ben got better. I got better too. I was starting to learn one of the reasons motherhood is so hard, and one of the reasons it is so rewarding, because it shifts your focus from yourself to another person. Motherhood was not a terrible trial that God had sent me. It was the biggest gift I'd ever received. After all, it was through being a parent that I started to understand just what it meant that God views us as His children, and I started to understand more about the heart's tremendous capacity for love. Through being a parent, I have gained a new understanding of spiritual practices, not just prayer, but service, celebration, simplicity, fellowship, as I try to teach my boys about these things. Usually instead, I learn from them because they already embody a lot of these spiritual practices. God has immensely blessed me and taught me through the experiences of motherhood. Instead of separating me from God, being a parent has brought me closer to God than ever before. I am part of God's redemptive story.